Margaret Chun had been invisible for most of her 43 years. She worked as a night janitor at the Sakura Community Center, arriving each evening at 10 o'clock when the last martial arts classes were ending and the instructors were locking up their equipment. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, and her movements were quiet and efficient as she mopped floors and emptied trash bins. The karate students barely acknowledged her existence, stepping around her cart of cleaning supplies as if she were just another piece of furniture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that Margaret had been watching them for 7 years. Every kick, every punch, every defensive stance had been absorbed by her keen eyes as she worked silently in the background. She had memorized the rhythm of their training, the philosophy behind their movements, and the subtle weaknesses that even their instructors failed to notice. Margaret had grown up in a small village in rural China where her grandmother had taught her the ancient art of Tai Chi, not the gentle exercise version practiced in parks, but the original martial application that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. Her grandmother had been a formidable woman who could defeat men twice her size using nothing but precise timing and an understanding of energy flow that seemed almost supernatural. Margaret had learned these techniques as a child, practicing in secret because her traditional father believed martial arts were only for men. When she immigrated to America at 19, she had buried those skills deep inside herself, focusing instead on survival, raising her daughter alone, and working whatever jobs would pay the bills. The Dragon's Fist Dojo occupied the largest room in the community center, and its head instructor, Master Kevin Thompson, was everything Margaret was not. He was loud, confident, and commanded respect through intimidation rather than skill. Thompson had earned his black belt through a series of weekend seminars and online courses, though he told his students he had trained for years in Japan under legendary masters. His technique was flashy but fundamentally flawed, relying on brute strength rather than proper form. The 6 students who formed Thompson's inner circle were equally arrogant. There was Derek, a stocky construction worker who threw his weight around like a weapon. Rachel, a fitness instructor who treated karate like an extreme workout routine. Marcus, a college student who had watched too many martial arts movies. Jennifer, a real estate agent who used her training to intimidate clients. David, a security guard who confused aggression with power. And Amanda, a personal trainer who believed that muscle mass was the only thing that mattered in combat. These 6 students had been training under Thompson for over 2 years, and they had developed a cruel habit of mocking anyone they perceived as weak. They would laugh at beginners who struggled with basic forms, make snide comments about older students who moved slowly, and generally create an atmosphere of toxic masculinity that drove away anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of what a martial artist should look like. Margaret had witnessed countless instances of their cruelty. She had seen them reduce teenage girls to tears with their harsh criticism. She had watched them drive away elderly students who simply wanted to learn self-defense. She had observed them mocking disabled veterans who were trying to rebuild their confidence through martial arts. Each incident had burned itself into her memory, adding fuel to a fire that had been building for years. The community center's director, Mrs. Patterson, had received numerous complaints about the hostile environment in the Dragon's Fist Dojo, but Thompson brought in significant revenue through his expensive classes and private lessons. He had convinced Mrs. Patterson that his harsh methods were necessary to produce serious martial artists, and that anyone who couldn't handle the pressure simply wasn't cut out for the martial arts. Margaret had never spoken up during these incidents. She was just the janitor after all, and her job depended on staying invisible and not causing trouble. But every evening as she cleaned the dojo, she would practice the movements she had learned from her grandmother, flowing through forms that were hundreds of years old, while the modern students were at home, bragging about their latest techniques. On social media, the transformation began on a Tuesday evening in March when Margaret witnessed something that finally pushed her past her breaking point. An 8-year-old girl named Emma had been brought to the dojo by her mother, who hoped that martial arts training would help her shy daughter build confidence and learn to defend herself against school bullies. Emma was small for her age, with thick glasses and a nervous stutter that made her an easy target for cruel children. Master Thompson had reluctantly agreed to let Emma join the beginners class, but it was clear from the start that he had no patience for teaching children, especially one who struggled with coordination and needed extra encouragement. The 6 advanced students were even worse, treating Emma's presence as a personal insult to their serious training environment. During Emma's 3rd lesson, she was attempting to learn a basic front kick when Derek decided to demonstrate what he called proper form. He stepped behind the little girl and began loudly criticizing her technique, his voice dripping with contempt as he pointed out every flaw in her movement. The other 5 students gathered around, adding their own harsh commentary and laughing at Emma's increasingly desperate attempts to perform the kick correctly. Rachel made a comment about how some people just weren't built for martial arts, while Marcus suggested that Emma might be better suited for ballet or some other girly activity. Jennifer added that real martial artists needed to have natural athleticism, something that Emma clearly lacked. David and Amanda exchanged meaningful glances and smirked as Emma's eyes began to fill with tears. Master Thompson did nothing to intervene. In fact, he seemed to encourage the harassment by nodding approvingly at his students' comments and adding his own observations about how martial arts required mental toughness that couldn't be taught to everyone. He suggested that Emma's mother might want to consider finding a different activity for her daughter, something that didn't require the dedication and discipline that true martial artists possessed. Margaret was emptying the trash can in the corner of the dojo when she heard Emma begin to cry. The little girl's shoulders shook as she tried to hold back her tears, but the sustained emotional assault had finally broken through her defenses. Her mother, who had been watching from the viewing area, rushed onto the mat to comfort her daughter, but the damage had already been done. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder and whispered that she wanted to go home and never come back. As Emma and her mother gathered their things to leave, Derek called out one final insult, suggesting that quitting was probably the smart choice since Emma would never be tough enough for real martial arts anyway. The other students laughed, and Master Thompson made no effort to discipline them or apologize for their behavior. Instead, he simply announced that class would continue and that serious students shouldn't let themselves be distracted by people who couldn't handle the pressure. Margaret watched Emma's mother carry her sobbing daughter out of the dojo, and something inside her snapped. She had spent 7 years watching these bullies destroy the confidence of innocent people, and she had remained silent because she was afraid of losing her job and the steady income that allowed her to support herself and send money to her elderly mother back in China. But seeing them reduce a child to tears simply because she didn't fit their narrow definition of what a martial artist should look like had finally pushed her beyond her limits. That night, Margaret went home to her small apartment and stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She was 43 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighed barely 110 pounds. Her hands were calloused from years of cleaning work, and her body showed the wear of a hard life spent in manual labor. By every conventional measure, she was exactly the type of person that the Dragon's Fist dojo would consider unfit for martial arts training. But Margaret knew something that Master Thompson and his students didn't understand. Real martial arts weren't about size or strength or intimidation. They were about understanding the flow of energy, about timing and precision, about using an opponent's force against them rather than meeting it head-on. Her grandmother had taught her that the greatest martial artists were often the ones who appeared the most ordinary, because they had learned to cultivate power from within rather than relying on external displays of dominance. Margaret spent the next 3 weeks preparing for what she knew would be the most important confrontation of her life. She couldn't directly challenge the students to a fight, because that would be seen as a janitor overstepping her bounds and would likely result in her immediate termination. Instead, she needed to create a situation where they would be forced to reveal their true nature in front of witnesses, and where her response would be seen as justified self-defense rather than aggression. The opportunity came during the dojo's monthly open house, an event designed to attract new students and showcase the skills of the current members. Margaret had volunteered to work extra hours that evening, ensuring that the facility was perfect for the demonstration. She arrived early to set up chairs for the audience and to make sure that every surface was spotless. As the evening began, Master Thompson introduced his 6 advanced students to the gathered crowd of prospective students and their families. He spoke at length about their dedication and skill, describing them as examples of what could be achieved through proper training under his guidance. The 6 students performed a series of choreographed demonstrations, breaking boards and executing flashy techniques that impressed the audience, but revealed fundamental flaws to anyone who truly understood martial arts. Margaret continued her cleaning duties in the background, invisible as always, but she was carefully observing everything that happened. She noticed that Derek relied too heavily on his forward momentum and would be vulnerable to a well-timed redirect. Rachel's high kicks left her off balance and exposed. Marcus telegraphed his punches with obvious wind-up motions. Jennifer's stance was too narrow, making her unstable. David's aggressive charges could be easily countered by someone who understood proper footwork. Amanda's muscle-bound frame had made her inflexible and slow. As the formal demonstration ended, Master Thompson invited the audience to ask questions and observe informal sparring sessions between his students. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. She approached the group of spectators and, in a voice barely above a whisper, asked if it would be possible for someone like her to learn martial arts. The question was overheard by Derek, who immediately began to laugh. He called the attention of the other 5 students, and soon all of them were staring at Margaret with undisguised amusement. Master Thompson, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his teaching philosophy to the prospective students, decided to make Margaret's question into a teaching moment. He explained to the audience that while martial arts were open to everyone, in theory, the reality was that some people simply lacked the physical and mental attributes necessary for serious training. He gestured toward Margaret, pointing out her small stature, her age, and her obviously sedentary lifestyle as examples of the challenges that would make martial arts training impractical for someone in her position. The 6 students began to add their own commentary, each one eager to demonstrate their knowledge by explaining why Margaret would never be able to succeed in martial arts. Derek mentioned her lack of muscle mass. Rachel pointed out her age and flexibility limitations. Marcus questioned whether she had the mental toughness required. Jennifer suggested that her work schedule would prevent proper training, David noted. Her timid demeanor, and Amanda simply stated that some people were born to be martial artists, while others were born to clean up after them. The audience was becoming uncomfortable with the increasingly cruel nature of the comments, but Master Thompson seemed to be enjoying the opportunity to establish his authority and demonstrate his students' loyalty to his teaching methods. He suggested that Margaret might be better served by taking up a more appropriate hobby for someone of her age and physical condition, perhaps something like knitting or gardening. Margaret listened to every word, her expression remaining calm and neutral as they systematically destroyed her in front of the assembled crowd. She had expected this reaction, had planned for it, and was prepared to use their arrogance against them. When they had finished their cruel assessment, she spoke again, her voice still quiet but carrying a subtle strength that hadn't been there before. She asked if there was any way she could prove that she was serious about learning martial arts, perhaps by demonstrating that she had at least some basic understanding of the principles involved. Master Thompson, sensing an opportunity to provide his audience with some entertainment at Margaret's expense, agreed to let her try a few basic techniques under the supervision of his advanced students. The 6 students formed a circle around Margaret, their expressions ranging from condescending amusement to barely concealed contempt. Master Thompson announced to the audience that they were about to witness a perfect example of why proper screening was so important in martial arts training, and that Margaret's inevitable failure would demonstrate the difference between serious martial artists and people who simply didn't understand what was required. Derek stepped forward first, offering to help Margaret learn a basic defensive stance. His approach was patronizing and deliberately designed to make her look foolish in front of the audience. He positioned himself behind her and began to physically manipulate her arms and legs, loudly explaining to the spectators how difficult it was for some people to understand even the most basic concepts of martial arts. Margaret allowed herself to be positioned like a puppet, her body appearing stiff and unnatural as Derek forced her into what he claimed was a proper fighting stance. The other students laughed at her awkward appearance, and some members of the audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, clearly disturbed by the cruel nature of the demonstration. Rachel stepped forward next, announcing that she would help Margaret learn a basic punch. She grabbed Margaret's wrist and began to manipulate her arm in an exaggerated punching motion, explaining to the audience that proper technique required years of training to develop, and that it was unrealistic to expect someone like Margaret to master these concepts quickly. Marcus, Jennifer, David, and Amanda each took turns positioning Margaret in different poses, each one designed to make her look more foolish than the last. They spoke about her as if she weren't there, referring to her as an example of what happened when people with unrealistic expectations tried to enter the martial arts world without understanding their own limitations. Throughout this humiliating display, Margaret remained perfectly calm. She allowed them to move her body into whatever positions they desired, never resisting or complaining, simply absorbing their techniques and understanding their timing. To the audience, she appeared to be a harmless middle-aged woman who was being cruelly mocked by a group of arrogant students. To Margaret, this was the most valuable training session of her life. Finally, Master Thompson decided that demonstration had gone on long enough. He thanked Margaret for being such a good sport and suggested that she might want to consider other activities that were more suitable for someone of her background and physical condition. He began to dismiss the audience, clearly satisfied that he had successfully demonstrated the superiority of his teaching methods and the advanced skills of his students. But Margaret wasn't finished. In the same quiet voice she had used throughout the evening, she asked if there was any way she could test what she had learned. She explained that she understood the students' concerns about her abilities, but that she had been practicing some techniques on her own and wondered if she might be able to demonstrate them. Master Thompson was momentarily taken aback by her persistence, but the 6 students were delighted by the opportunity to further humiliate her. Derek suggested that Margaret might like to try some light sparring, just to see how much she had really learned. The other students immediately agreed, each one eager to be the first to demonstrate the gap between her amateur understanding and their professional skills. Margaret accepted their challenge with a small nod, her expression remaining as calm and unremarkable as it had been throughout the evening. She asked if it would be possible to work with all 6 students at once, explaining that she wanted to learn as much as possible from the experience and that having multiple instructors would be more educational for her. The students exchanged glances, barely able to contain their excitement at the prospect of such an easy victory. Master Thompson hesitated for a moment, concerned that 6-on-1 might appear too brutal to the audience, but the students assured him that they would be gentle with Margaret and that the experience would be educational for everyone involved. The audience was clearly uncomfortable with what was about to happen, but they were also curious to see how the confrontation would unfold. Some of the parents were already gathering their children, preparing to leave before the situation became too unpleasant to watch. Margaret moved to the center of the mat, her posture still appearing awkward and uncertain. The 6 students spread out around her, their movements confident and predatory as they prepared to demonstrate their superiority. Master Thompson positioned himself where he could observe the action and intervene if necessary, though he was clearly expecting the confrontation to be over quickly. Derek was the first to move, launching himself forward with a clumsy combination of punches that telegraphed his intentions from across the room. Margaret seemed to barely move, but Derek found himself flying through the air, his momentum redirected by a subtle shift in her position that sent him crashing into the wall behind her. The impact was so sudden and unexpected that the audience gasped in surprise. Before anyone could process what had happened, Rachel attacked from the opposite side, her high kick aimed at Margaret's head. Margaret ducked under the kick and simultaneously swept Rachel's supporting leg, sending the fitness instructor tumbling to the ground with a thud that echoed through the dojo. The entire movement had taken less than 2 seconds. Marcus rushed forward next, throwing a series of wild punches that Margaret avoided with minimal effort, her body swaying like a reed in the wind as his fists passed harmlessly through the air where she had been standing. A gentle touch to his wrist sent him spinning off balance, and he collided with Jennifer, who was approaching from his left. David and Amanda attacked simultaneously, their combined assault representing the full force of their anger and humiliation. Margaret moved between them like water flowing around stones, her hands making brief contact with their arms and shoulders in movements so subtle that they were barely visible to the audience. Both students found themselves thrown to the ground by forces they couldn't understand or counter. Jennifer, the last student standing, hesitated for a moment, clearly shaken by the rapid defeat of her companions. She launched herself at Margaret with a desperate scream, her hands reaching for Margaret's throat in a move that was more street fighting than martial arts. Margaret caught Jennifer's wrists and used the woman's own momentum to send her gently, but firmly to the ground, where she joined her 5 companions in a heap of defeated arrogance. The entire confrontation had lasted exactly 2 minutes. 6 advanced students, each one larger and seemingly stronger than Margaret, lay groaning on the mat while the quiet janitor stood in the center of the dojo, her breathing still calm and quoting still calm, and Koshim stood in the center of the dojo, her breathing center of the dojo. Regular, her expression unchanged from the beginning of the evening. Master Thompson stood frozen in shock, his mouth open as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The audience was equally stunned, some of them standing up in their chairs to get a better view of the impossible scene before them. The 6 students slowly picked themselves up from the floor, their faces red with embarrassment and confusion as they tried to understand how they had been so completely and effortlessly defeated. Margaret looked around at the defeated students, her expression still calm, but now carrying a subtle authority that hadn't been there before. She spoke in the same quiet voice she had used throughout the evening, but now her words carried the weight of demonstrated truth rather than humble questioning. She explained to the audience that real martial arts were not about size or strength or intimidation. They were about understanding the flow of energy, about timing and precision, about using an opponent's force against them rather than meeting it head-on. She had learned these principles from her grandmother, who had taught her that the greatest martial artists were often the ones who appeared the most ordinary, because they had learned to cultivate power from within rather than relying on external displays of dominance. Margaret turned to Master Thompson and quietly informed him that she would be starting her own martial arts class at the community center, one that would be open to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their age, size, or physical condition. She explained that real martial arts were about building confidence and character, Not about tearing down people who didn't fit arbitrary standards of what a martial artist should look like. She mentioned that her first priority would be to invite back all the students who had been driven away by the hostile environment of the Dragon's Fist dojo, starting with little Emma, who deserved to learn martial arts from someone who understood that true strength came from within, not from the ability to intimidate others. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm as they realized they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Parents who had been considering enrollment in Master Thompson's classes were now approaching Margaret, asking about her teaching philosophy and when her classes would begin. Master Thompson tried to regain control of the situation, claiming that Margaret's victory had been a fluke and that his students had simply been caught off guard by her unconventional approach. But his words rang hollow in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. The 6 students, still nursing their bruises and wounded pride, could offer no explanation for their defeat other than muttered claims that Margaret had somehow cheated or used illegal techniques. Margaret gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave, but before she walked out of the dojo, she turned back to face the 6 students one final time. She told them that they had potential to become real martial artists, but only if they learned to treat others with respect and humility. She explained that their technical skills were adequate, but their attitudes had corrupted their understanding of what martial arts were truly about. She offered to teach them proper technique if they were willing to start over as white belts and learn what it meant to be genuine martial artists rather than bullies who used their training to intimidate others. The offer was genuine, but it would require them to abandon their egos and accept instruction from someone they had spent years dismissing as beneath their notice. As Margaret walked out of the dojo, she could hear the excited conversations of the audience members who were already planning to enroll in her classes. She could also hear Master Thompson arguing with Mrs. Patterson about the evening's events, his voice growing increasingly desperate as he realized that his position at the community center was now in jeopardy. The 6 students stood in the center of the mat, their earlier confidence completely shattered by the reality of their defeat. They had been exposed as frauds in front of an audience that had witnessed their cruelty and their weakness in equal measure. Some of them would eventually take Margaret up on her offer to retrain them properly, while others would quietly disappear from the martial arts community, too embarrassed to continue their studies. Margaret's grandmother had been right about many things, but she had been especially right about the idea that true martial arts were about character development rather than physical dominance. The techniques were important, but they were meaningless without the wisdom to use them properly and the humility to understand that real strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the community center to find a line of prospective students waiting outside the building. Emma was at the front of the line, holding her mother's hand and wearing a shy smile that hadn't been there the week before. Behind them were dozens of other people who had been inspired by what they had witnessed the previous evening, all of them eager to learn martial arts from someone who understood that true strength was measured not by the ability to defeat others, but by the willingness to help them become stronger. Margaret unlocked the door to the dojo and began to prepare for her first class as a martial arts instructor. She was still the same quiet, unassuming woman who had spent 7 years cleaning floors and emptying trash cans, but now everyone knew that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose to remain invisible until the moment when their strength is needed most. Margaret's transformation from invisible janitor to respected martial arts instructor didn't happen overnight, despite the dramatic nature of her confrontation with the 6 students. The morning after the open house demonstration, she found herself facing a completely different set of challenges that would test her resolve in ways that physical combat never could. Mrs. Patterson, the community center director, summoned Margaret to her office before the building officially opened. The older woman sat behind her desk with a stack of incident reports, liability forms, and what appeared to be several angry emails printed out and highlighted in yellow marker. Her expression was a mixture of concern, confusion, and barely concealed panic as she tried to process the events of the previous evening. Margaret had expected this meeting. She understood that her actions, while justified in her mind, had created a significant administrative headache for Mrs. Patterson. The Dragon's Fist dojo brought in substantial revenue for the community center, and Master Thompson had already called 3 times that morning to demand that Margaret be fired for what he claimed was an unprovoked attack on his students. Mrs. Patterson began the conversation by acknowledging that she had witnessed Margaret's demonstration and found it remarkable, but she explained that the community center couldn't afford to lose the income generated by Thompson's classes. She had received calls from the insurance company asking about potential liability issues, complaints from some of Thompson's supporters claiming that Margaret had used excessive force, and threats of legal action from at least 2 of the defeated students. Margaret listened patiently as Mrs. Patterson outlined the various problems that had emerged from the previous evening's events. She understood the woman's position and didn't blame her for being concerned about the financial and legal implications. When Mrs. Patterson finished speaking, Margaret made a proposal that would change everything. She offered to teach martial arts classes at the community center on a volunteer basis for the first 3 months, asking only for a small room and basic liability coverage. If her classes proved popular and generated positive feedback, they could discuss a more formal arrangement. If they failed to attract students or caused problems, she would quietly return to her janitorial duties and never mention martial arts again. Mrs. Patterson was skeptical but intrigued. Margaret's demonstration had clearly impressed many of the people who witnessed it, and several prospective students had already called asking about enrollment in her classes. After lengthy consideration and consultation with the community center's board of directors, Mrs. Patterson agreed to give Margaret a trial period. The compromise solution was announced that afternoon. Master Thompson would continue teaching his advanced classes for current students, while Margaret would be allowed to start a beginner's program focused on traditional martial arts philosophy and practical self-defense. The 2 programs would operate independently, with separate class times and different areas of the facility. Master Thompson was furious about the arrangement, but he was in no position to object strenuously. Video footage from the community center's security cameras had captured his students' cruel treatment of little Emma, and several parents had already withdrawn their children from his classes in response to what they had witnessed. His position was precarious, and he knew that pushing too hard might result in his complete removal from the facility. The 6 students who had been defeated by Margaret reacted differently to the new arrangement. Derek, still nursing bruises from his impact with the wall, publicly dismissed Margaret's classes as a joke and claimed that anyone could get lucky once. Rachel attempted to minimize her defeat by suggesting that she had been caught off guard by Margaret's unconventional approach. Marcus threw himself into training with renewed intensity, clearly shaken by the realization that his understanding of martial arts was fundamentally flawed. Jennifer took a more pragmatic approach, quietly enrolling in Margaret's classes under an assumed name to learn what she had missed in her previous training. David continued to insist that the entire confrontation had been staged, though his arguments became less convincing each time he repeated them. Amanda simply disappeared from the community center entirely, too embarrassed to face the other students after her public humiliation. Margaret's first official class was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and she spent the intervening days carefully planning her curriculum and teaching approach. She knew that many of her students would be people who had been intimidated or discouraged by traditional martial arts environments, and she wanted to create an atmosphere that was welcoming, supportive, and focused on personal growth rather than competition. She reached out to Emma's mother, personally inviting the little girl to return and assuring her that the new classes would be completely different from her previous experience. She also contacted several other former students who had left the Dragon's Fist Dojo due to Thompson's harsh methods, explaining her teaching philosophy and encouraging them to give martial arts another chance. The response was overwhelming. By the day of her first class, Margaret had received inquiries from 47 prospective students, ranging in age from 7 to 73. They included former victims of Thompson's bullying, people with physical disabilities who had been told they weren't suited for martial arts, elderly individuals seeking practical self-defense skills, and parents who wanted their children to learn discipline and confidence without being subjected to unnecessary cruelty. Margaret arrived at the community center 2 hours early on Thursday evening to prepare the smaller gymnasium that had been assigned to her classes. She arranged the mats in a circle rather than traditional rows, symbolizing her belief that martial arts were about community and mutual support rather than hierarchy and dominance. She set up a small shrine in one corner with a photograph of her grandmother and some incense, creating a connection to the traditional roots of her training. When the students began to arrive, Margaret greeted each one personally, learning their names and asking about their goals and concerns. Emma was among the first to enter, clinging to her mother's hand but showing more confidence than she had displayed during her previous attempt at martial arts training. Behind her came a diverse group of individuals who had all been drawn to Margaret's promise of a different kind of martial arts experience. There was Robert, a 68-year-old retired accountant who wanted to learn self-defense after being mugged outside his apartment building. Sarah, a college student who had been sexually assaulted and needed to rebuild her sense of personal power. Michael, a 12-year-old boy with cerebral palsy whose parents had been told he would never be able to participate in physical activities. Linda, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs and needed an outlet for the stress and frustration of her daily life. The diversity of the group would have been overwhelming to most traditional martial arts instructors, but Margaret saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate the true universality of martial arts principles. She understood that each student would need individual attention and customized instruction, but she also knew that they could learn from each other in ways that would benefit everyone. Margaret began the class by explaining her teaching philosophy and the history of the techniques they would be learning. She spoke about her grandmother's teachings and the importance of martial arts as a tool for personal development rather than aggression. She emphasized that strength came in many forms and that everyone in the room had the potential to become a skilled martial artist if they were willing to commit to the principles of discipline, respect, and continuous learning. The first lesson focused on breathing and meditation, concepts that surprised many of the students who had expected to jump immediately into physical techniques. Margaret explained that martial arts began with understanding and controlling one's own body, and Margaret explained that martial arts began with understanding and controlling one's own body, and mind, and that external techniques were meaningless without this internal foundation. She guided the students through a series of breathing exercises designed to calm the mind and center the body. Even Emma, who had been nervous and fidgety at the beginning of class, found herself relaxing as Margaret's gentle voice helped her focus on the rhythm of her breath. The other students, despite their diverse backgrounds and physical capabilities, all responded positively to the meditative approach. After 20 minutes of breathing and centering exercises, Margaret introduced the first physical techniques. Rather than starting with strikes or kicks, she focused on basic movements and stances that emphasized balance, flexibility, and body awareness. She demonstrated each technique slowly and clearly, then moved through the group, providing individual instruction and encouragement. Margaret's teaching style was the complete opposite of Master Thompson's approach. Where he had emphasized perfection and criticism, she focused on effort and improvement. Where he had used humiliation as a motivational tool, she offered gentle corrections and positive reinforcement. Where he had created an atmosphere of competition and hierarchy, she fostered cooperation and mutual support. Emma's transformation was particularly remarkable. Under Thompson's harsh instruction, she had been timid and afraid of making mistakes. With Margaret's patient guidance, she began to move with growing confidence, her natural grace becoming apparent. As she learned to trust her own abilities, her mother, watching from the sidelines, was moved to tears as she saw her daughter's self-esteem begin to rebuild. Robert, the elderly accountant, initially struggled with the physical demands of the training, but Margaret adapted the techniques to accommodate his limitations while still teaching him effective self-defense principles. She showed him how to use proper timing and positioning to overcome the disadvantages of age and reduced mobility, transforming his perceived weaknesses into tactical advantages. Sarah, the assault survivor, found healing in the controlled environment of Margaret's dojo. The ability to practice defensive techniques in a safe space with supportive classmates helped her begin to reclaim her sense of personal power. Margaret worked with her individually after class, teaching her specific techniques for escaping common attack scenarios and helping her rebuild the confidence that her attacker had stolen. Michael, the boy with cerebral palsy, amazed everyone with his determination and rapid progress. Margaret modified the techniques to work with his physical limitations, but she never lowered her expectations or treated him as less capable than the other students. His success became an inspiration to the entire class and a powerful demonstration of the inclusive nature of true martial arts. As the weeks passed, Margaret's classes grew in both size and reputation. Word spread throughout the community about the remarkable woman who was teaching martial arts to people who had been rejected or discouraged by traditional schools. Local newspapers wrote articles about her inclusive approach, and martial arts instructors from other cities began visiting to observe her teaching methods. The success of Margaret's program created new challenges and opportunities. The community center's board of directors, impressed by the positive feedback and growing enrollment, offered her a permanent position as a martial arts instructor with a salary and benefits package. Local businesses began offering sponsorships and equipment donations to support her classes. More importantly, Margaret's students began to achieve remarkable personal transformations that went far beyond physical technique. Emma not only regained her confidence but became a leader among the younger students, helping newcomers feel welcome and demonstrating that size and age were irrelevant to martial arts success. Robert successfully defended himself during a second attempted mugging, using the techniques Margaret had taught him to escape without injury. Sarah began teaching self-defense workshops for other assault survivors, using Margaret's methods to help other women reclaim their sense of personal power. Michael's progress inspired other children with disabilities to join the classes, creating a supportive community that challenged conventional assumptions about physical limitations. The transformation wasn't limited to Margaret's students. Several members of the original Dragon's Fist dojo, having witnessed the positive atmosphere and genuine skill development in Margaret's classes, quietly approached her about switching programs. Even some of Thompson's former supporters began to question his methods as they saw the contrast between his harsh approach and Margaret's nurturing instruction. Jennifer, who had been secretly attending Margaret's classes under an assumed name, finally revealed her identity and formally requested to become a student. She publicly apologized for her previous behavior and asked Margaret to help her unlearn the bad habits and negative attitudes she had developed under Thompson's instruction. Marcus made a similar transition, acknowledging that his previous training had been based more on ego and fantasy than genuine martial arts principles. He became one of Margaret's most dedicated students, eventually earning the privilege of assisting with beginning classes and serving as a positive role model for newer students. The changes extended beyond individual students to the broader community. The community center became known as a place where anyone could learn martial arts, regardless of their background or physical condition. Parents who had previously avoided martial arts programs began enrolling their children, knowing that they would be treated with respect and encouraged to reach their full potential. Margaret's success also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Traditional martial arts masters from other cities began visiting her classes, curious about the woman who had developed such an effective teaching methodology. Some came as skeptics, expecting to find watered-down techniques and lowered standards. Instead, they discovered rigorous training that produced skilled martial artists who understood both the physical and philosophical aspects of their art. One visitor was Master Liu, an elderly Chinese man who had trained in the same village where Margaret's grandmother had learned her techniques. He had heard rumors about an American woman who was teaching traditional Chinese martial arts and had come to investigate whether she was appropriately representing the ancient traditions. Master Liu observed several of Margaret's classes without introducing himself, carefully evaluating her techniques and teaching methods. He was impressed not only by her technical skill, but by her deep understanding of the philosophical principles that formed the foundation of traditional martial arts. When he finally revealed his identity, he offered to share additional techniques and historical knowledge that had been passed down through his own family lineage. The collaboration between Margaret and Master Liu added new dimensions to her teaching program. He brought ancient forms and meditation practices that complemented her practical self-defense instruction, creating a comprehensive curriculum that honored traditional martial arts while remaining accessible to modern students with diverse needs and backgrounds. Master Thompson's position at the community center became increasingly untenable as more students transferred to Margaret's program and complaints about his methods continued to accumulate. The final blow came when a local newspaper published an investigative article about bullying in martial arts schools, featuring extensive quotes from former Dragon's Fist students who described their experiences under his instruction. Faced with declining enrollment and mounting negative publicity, Thompson was forced to close his program and leave the community center. His departure was unlamented by most students and parents, who had grown tired of his emphasis on intimidation and aggression over genuine martial arts education. Derek, the most aggressive of Thompson's former students, attempted to start his own martial arts program at a different facility, but his reputation for bullying followed him. His classes failed to attract students, and he eventually abandoned martial arts entirely, though not before making several unsuccessful attempts to discredit Margaret's program through online reviews and social media campaigns. Rachel found work as a fitness instructor at a local gym, where her aggressive personality was better suited to high-intensity workout programs. She occasionally made disparaging comments about Margaret's soft approach to martial arts, but her opinions carried little weight with people who had witnessed Margaret's demonstration of genuine skill. Amanda left town entirely, reportedly moving to another state where her humiliating defeat wouldn't be common knowledge. David returned to his security guard job and avoided any further involvement with martial arts, apparently having learned that his understanding of combat was far more limited than he had believed. The transformation of the community center's martial arts program became a model for other facilities throughout the region. Martial arts instructors began adopting Margaret's inclusive teaching methods, and several universities invited her to speak about the psychological and social benefits of her approach to martial arts education. Margaret's success brought opportunities to expand her program beyond the community center. She was offered positions at prestigious martial arts academies and invited to open her own commercial school. But she chose to remain at the community center where she could continue serving people who might not be able to afford expensive private instruction. Her decision to prioritize accessibility over profit reflected the values her grandmother had taught her about the true purpose of martial arts. She understood that genuine martial arts instruction should be available to everyone who was willing to learn, regardless of their economic status or social position. The evening classes at the community center became a gathering place for people from all walks of life, who shared a common interest in personal development through martial arts training. The diverse group of students created an atmosphere of mutual respect and support that attracted positive attention from throughout the community. Margaret's reputation grew beyond the local area as martial arts publications wrote articles about her innovative teaching methods and remarkable success with non-traditional students. She received invitations to teach seminars and workshops at martial arts conferences, sharing her philosophy and techniques with instructors from around the world. Despite her growing fame, Margaret remained humble and focused on her students' development rather than her own recognition. She continued to work as a janitor at the community center, arriving early each evening to clean and prepare the facilities before teaching her classes. Her dual role as both custodian and instructor served as a powerful reminder that true martial arts mastery was about service to others rather than personal glory. The contrast between Margaret's approach and that of typical commercial martial arts schools attracted the attention of researchers who were studying the psychological benefits of different teaching methodologies. A team from the local university began conducting a longitudinal study of her students, documenting their improvements in confidence, physical fitness, and overall well-being. The preliminary results of the research were remarkable. Students in Margaret's program showed significantly greater improvements in self-esteem, stress management, and social skills compared to students in traditional martial arts programs. The inclusive atmosphere and emphasis on personal growth rather than competition created an environment where people felt safe to take risks and push their boundaries. Emma, now one of Margaret's most advanced students despite her young age, became a particularly compelling case study. Her transformation from a timid, bullied child to a confident young martial artist demonstrated the potential for martial arts training to address psychological trauma and build resilience. Margaret's influence extended beyond her immediate students to their families and broader social circles. Parents reported that their children were more confident and respectful at home after joining her classes. Spouses noticed improvements in their partner's stress levels and overall happiness. The positive changes rippled outward through the community, creating a network of people who had been touched by Margaret's teaching philosophy. The success of her program also attracted criticism from some quarters of the traditional martial arts community. Conservative instructors argued that her inclusive approach lowered standards and diluted the warrior traditions that they believed were essential to authentic martial arts training. They claimed that accepting students with physical limitations or emotional trauma compromised the integrity of the art. Margaret responded to these criticisms by demonstrating that her students could perform at levels equal to or superior to those trained in traditional programs. When her students competed in regional tournaments, they consistently placed well against opponents from schools with more rigid training methodologies. More importantly, Margaret's students demonstrated character and sportsmanship that reflected positively on their training. They helped opponents who fell during competitions, congratulated winners graciously, and showed respect for judges and officials even when they disagreed with decisions. The behavior of Margaret's students at competitions became legendary among tournament organizers and other competitors. Their demonstration of true martial arts values helped change perceptions about what constituted proper martial arts training and character development. As Margaret's reputation grew, she began receiving visitors from around the world who wanted to study her methods and observe her classes. Martial arts instructors from Japan, Korea, China, and other traditional martial arts centers acknowledged that she had developed something special that honored the ancient traditions while making them accessible to modern students. The international recognition led to invitations for Margaret to travel and teach workshops in other countries, but she declined most of these opportunities in order to remain focused on her local students. She understood that her greatest contribution to the martial arts world was the daily work of transforming individual lives through patient, dedicated instruction. Margaret's story had become an inspiration to martial arts instructors worldwide, but she remained grounded in the practical work of teaching techniques, building confidence, and helping people discover their own potential for strength and growth. Every evening when she unlocked the doors to the community center, she was reminded of the responsibility she carried and the privilege she had been given to guide others on their martial arts journey. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the community center as Margaret arrived for what would become the most significant day in her teaching career. 3 years had passed since her confrontation with Master Thompson's students, and her martial arts program had grown into something she never could have imagined when she first picked up that mop and bucket in the Dragon's Fist dojo. The community center had undergone extensive renovations to accommodate the expanding program. What had once been a single room with worn mats now encompassed 3 dedicated training areas, a meditation garden, and a small library filled with martial arts texts in multiple languages. The walls displayed photographs of students at various stages of their journey, from tentative beginners to confident black belts who had gone on to teach their own classes. Margaret stood in the main training hall, reviewing the schedule for the day's events. The community center was hosting its first annual Harmony Tournament, an event she had designed to showcase the principles that had guided her teaching from the beginning. Unlike traditional martial arts competitions that emphasized winning and losing, the Harmony Tournament focused on personal growth, technical excellence, and the demonstration of character under pressure. Competitors would be evaluated not only on their physical techniques but also on their sportsmanship, their ability to help and encourage other participants, and their embodiment of the philosophical principles that form the foundation of true martial arts. The tournament had attracted participants from across the country, including several students from schools that had adopted Margaret's teaching methodology. Emma, now 14 years old and a junior instructor in Margaret's program, was putting the finishing touches on the registration area. The shy, stuttering child who had once been reduced to tears by cruel comments had blossomed into a poised young woman whose confidence inspired everyone around her. She had earned her black belt 6 months earlier, becoming the youngest student ever to achieve that rank in Margaret's program. Emma's transformation represented everything that Margaret's teaching philosophy sought to accomplish. The girl had learned not only to defend herself physically, but had developed the inner strength to stand up for others who were being bullied or intimidated. She regularly spoke at schools and community events about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their size, age, or physical abilities. Robert, the elderly accountant who had joined Margaret's first class 3 years earlier, was now serving as one of the tournament judges. His journey from frightened crime victim to confident martial artist had been documented in several academic papers about the psychological benefits of martial arts training for older adults. At 71, he moved with the grace and confidence of someone half his age, and his calm presence had a stabilizing effect on younger students who were nervous about competition. Sarah, the college student who had sought healing after her assault, had graduated and become a social worker specializing in trauma recovery. She had developed a martial arts therapy program that combined Margaret's teaching methods with professional counseling techniques, helping other survivors rebuild their sense of personal power and safety. Her work had been recognized by several national organizations, and she frequently collaborated with Margaret on workshops for mental health professionals. Michael, the boy with cerebral palsy who had amazed everyone with his determination, was now 18 and preparing to enter college on a scholarship he had earned through his martial arts achievements and community service work. His success had shattered stereotypes about what people with disabilities could accomplish, and he had become an advocate for inclusive sports programs throughout the region. These success stories were repeated dozens of times throughout Margaret's program. Students who had been written off by other instructors, dismissed as too weak or too different, had found their strength and purpose through her patient guidance. The cumulative impact of their transformations had rippled outward through families, schools, and workplaces, creating a network of people who understood that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The harmony. Tournament had also attracted some unexpected participants. Jennifer, the former Dragon's Fist student who had initially mocked Margaret, was now one of her most dedicated instructors. She had spent 2 years unlearning the aggressive habits and negative attitudes she had developed under Master Thompson's instruction, and her journey from bully to healer had become one of the most powerful testimonies to the transformative potential of proper martial arts training. Marcus had taken a different path, but had achieved equally impressive results. After leaving Margaret's program as a skilled martial artist with a completely different mindset about competition and cooperation, he had joined the military where his combination of technical skill and leadership ability had earned him rapid promotion. He credited Margaret's teaching with giving him the confidence and ethical foundation that had made his military success possible. Even Derek, the most aggressive of Thompson's former students, had eventually found his way back to martial arts through Margaret's program. It had taken him nearly 2 years to swallow his pride and admit that his previous training had been fundamentally flawed, but his eventual transformation had been as dramatic as anyone's. He now worked as a counselor for troubled youth, using martial arts training to help young people channel their anger and frustration into positive outlets. The tournament began with a ceremony that reflected Margaret's philosophy about the true purpose of martial arts competition. Instead of intimidating displays of breaking boards or aggressive sparring demonstrations, the opening focused on the history and philosophy of martial arts as a tool for personal development and community building. Master Liu, who had become a permanent fixture at the community center after his initial visit 3 years earlier, spoke about the ancient traditions that had given birth to martial arts and the responsibility that modern practitioners carried to honor those traditions while adapting them to contemporary needs. His words carried particular weight because of his own background and his recognition of Margaret as a true inheritor of the classical martial arts legacy. The tournament events were designed to showcase different aspects of martial arts mastery. Traditional forms competitions allowed participants to demonstrate their understanding of classical techniques and their ability to embody the flowing, meditative aspects of martial arts. Practical self-defense scenarios tested students' ability to apply their training in realistic situations while maintaining control and avoiding unnecessary harm to their opponents. The most innovative event was called Adaptive Mastery, where participants were given physical or mental challenges that required them to modify their techniques on the spot. A competitor might be blindfolded and asked to defend against multiple attackers or given a physical limitation that forced them to rely on different muscle groups than they normally used. The event was designed to test not only technical skill, but also creativity, adaptability, and mental resilience. Emma competed in the junior division and dominated every event she entered, but what impressed the judges most was her behavior between competitions. She spent her time helping other competitors prepare, offering encouragement to nervous participants, and demonstrating techniques for students from other schools who were struggling with particular challenges. When Emma was declared the overall champion in her division, her acceptance speech focused not on her own achievements, but on thanking her fellow competitors for pushing her to perform at her best. She used the platform to encourage other young people to view martial arts as a way to build character and serve their communities rather than simply as a way to learn fighting techniques. Robert competed in the senior division and performed admirably, but his greatest contribution to the tournament came through his role as a mentor and judge. He had a gift for seeing potential in struggling competitors and offering exactly the right encouragement or technical advice to help them break through their limitations. Several participants later said that his guidance had been more valuable than any trophy they could have won. Sarah participated in the Adaptive Mastery event and used it as an opportunity to demonstrate how martial arts training could help people overcome trauma and rebuild confidence. Her performance was technically excellent, but more importantly, it served as inspiration for other survivors of violence who were considering martial arts training as part of their healing process. Michael's participation in the tournament attracted significant media attention, not only because of his physical challenges, but because of the skill level he had achieved despite them. His forms demonstration was flawless, and his self-defense techniques showed that he had learned to turn his apparent disadvantages into tactical advantages. The tournament's most emotional moment came during the team events, where mixed groups of competitors from different schools worked together to solve complex martial arts challenges. The cooperation and mutual support displayed by participants from Margaret's program influenced competitors from other schools, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie that many had never experienced in martial arts competition. One particularly memorable moment occurred when a young competitor from a traditional school began to cry after making a mistake during his forms demonstration. Instead of continuing with their own preparations, several of Margaret's students surrounded the boy, offering comfort and encouragement until he was ready to try again. The gesture was captured by photographers and became one of the defining images of the tournament. Margaret watched the events unfold with deep satisfaction, not because her students were winning competitions, but because they were demonstrating the values she had worked so hard to instill in them. They understood that true victory in martial arts came not from defeating opponents, but from helping everyone involved reach their highest potential. The tournament also served as a reunion for many of Margaret's former students who had moved away or gone on to other pursuits. Military personnel on leave, college students home for vacation, and working professionals who had started their own martial arts programs all returned to participate in the event and reconnect with the community that had shaped their character. The diversity of careers and life paths represented among Margaret's former students was remarkable. There were teachers and doctors, police officers and social workers, business executives and artists, all of whom credited their martial arts training with giving them the confidence and ethical foundation they needed to succeed in their chosen fields. One former student had become a high school principal and had implemented a martial arts-based anti-bullying program at her school. Another had joined the Peace Corps and was teaching self-defense classes to women in developing countries. A third had started a non-profit organization that provided free martial arts instruction to underprivileged children in urban areas. The common thread among all of these success stories was the understanding that martial arts training was about much more than learning to fight. Margaret's students had absorbed the lesson that true strength came from service to others, and they had carried that principle into every aspect of their lives. As the tournament drew to a close, Margaret was asked to give the closing address to the assembled participants and spectators. She took the stage with the same quiet confidence that had characterized her teaching from the beginning, looking out at an audience that included people whose lives had been transformed by her guidance and philosophy. Margaret began her speech by acknowledging the remarkable progress that had been made in changing perceptions about what martial arts could and should be. When she had first challenged Master Thompson's students 3 years earlier, few people understood that martial arts could be a tool for healing, inclusion, and community building rather than just aggression and competition. She spoke about the importance of maintaining the warrior traditions that form the historical foundation of martial arts, while adapting those traditions to serve the needs of contemporary society. The ancient masters who had developed these techniques understood that the ultimate purpose of martial arts was to create better human beings, not just more effective fighters. Margaret emphasized that the success of her program was not due to any special techniques or revolutionary teaching methods, but rather to a return to the fundamental principles that had always defined authentic martial arts instruction. Respect for students, emphasis on character development, and commitment to serving the broader community were not new ideas but rather timeless values that had been temporarily forgotten by some modern schools. She challenged the audience to think about their own roles in continuing this transformation of martial arts culture. Every instructor had the power to choose between building up their students or tearing them down. Every student had the opportunity to use their training to help others or to intimidate them. Every school could decide whether to be inclusive or exclusive, whether to emphasize character or just technique. Margaret's speech concluded with a call to action that went beyond martial arts to encompass all aspects of life. She urged the audience to look for opportunities to help people who had been overlooked or underestimated, to stand up for those who were being bullied or marginalized, and to remember that true strength was measured not by the ability to defeat others, but by the willingness to lift them up. The standing ovation that followed Margaret's speech lasted for several minutes, but she seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. She had never sought recognition for her accomplishments and remained focused on the daily work of teaching and serving her students rather than on building her own reputation. After the formal conclusion of the tournament, Margaret returned to her normal routine of cleaning and preparing the facility for the next day's classes. She was joined by several of her senior students who insisted on helping with the cleanup, and their conversation turned to plans for expanding the program to serve even more people who could benefit from inclusive martial arts instruction. Emma announced that she had been accepted to a university program in education and planned to study how martial arts instruction could be integrated into traditional academic curricula. She wanted to develop age-appropriate programs that could help children learn discipline, respect, and confidence alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. Robert revealed that he was working with a group of senior centers to establish martial arts programs specifically designed for elderly participants. He had seen firsthand how proper instruction could improve balance, flexibility, and mental acuity in older adults, and he wanted to make those benefits available to as many seniors as possible. Sarah was expanding her trauma recovery program and had received funding to train other social workers in the techniques she had developed. Her goal was to create a network of therapists who could use martial arts-based interventions to help survivors of violence rebuild their sense of personal power and safety. Michael was planning to study adaptive technologies in college and wanted to develop equipment and training modifications that would make martial arts accessible to people with various physical disabilities. His own experience had shown him that perceived limitations were often just challenges that required creative solutions. These conversations represented the continuing evolution of Margaret's influence beyond her direct teaching. Her students had become leaders and innovators in their own right, carrying her philosophy into new contexts and finding fresh applications for the principles she had taught them. The success of the Harmony Tournament also attracted attention from national martial arts organizations that were interested in adopting similar approaches to competition and instruction. Margaret received invitations to serve on committees developing new standards for martial arts schools and to help design certification programs for instructors who wanted to specialize in inclusive teaching methods. Margaret accepted some of these opportunities, recognizing that her influence could be multiplied by training other instructors in the methods she had developed. However, she insisted on maintaining her primary focus on direct teaching at the community center, understanding that her greatest contribution would always be the daily work of transforming individual lives through patient, dedicated instruction. The transformation of the community center's martial arts program had become a model for facilities throughout the country. But Margaret knew that the real measure of success was not in recognition or awards, but in the changed lives of her students. Every person who left her classes with greater confidence, every child who learned to stand up to bullies without becoming one themselves, every adult who discovered strength they never knew they possessed represented a victory that was more meaningful than any tournament trophy. As Margaret turned off the lights in the training hall that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible janitor to respected instructor and mentor. The path had not always been easy, and there had been moments when She questioned whether she was making the right choices or having any real impact. But the evidence of that impact was all around her in the form of students who had found their strength, families who had been brought closer together, and a community that had learned to value character over conquest. Margaret's grandmother had been right about the true purpose of martial arts, and Margaret had proven that those ancient principles could thrive in a modern world that desperately needed their wisdom. The next morning brought a new group of beginning students, including several children who had heard about the tournament and wanted to learn from the woman who had created such an inspiring environment. Margaret greeted each new student with the same patience and encouragement she had shown to Emma 3 years earlier, understanding that every person who walked through her doors carried the potential for remarkable transformation. Margaret's story had become legendary in martial arts circles, but she remained grounded in the practical work of teaching basic techniques to nervous beginners and helping experienced students refine their understanding of advanced principles. She knew that lasting change happened one student at a time, one class at a time, one moment of encouragement at a time. The simple woman who had once been dismissed as too small and too ordinary to matter had proven that the most powerful transformations often came from the most unexpected sources. Margaret Chun had shown that being underestimated could be an advantage, that being overlooked could be a strength, and that the person who changed everything was often the person no one had expected to be there when it mattered most. Her legacy lived on in every student who learned to see martial arts as a tool for building character rather than just winning fights, in every instructor who chose encouragement over intimidation, and in every person who discovered that true strength came from helping others reach their full potential. The ripple effects of her influence would continue to spread long after she was gone, touching lives and transforming communities in ways that could never be fully measured or completely understood. Margaret's grandmother had taught her that the greatest warriors were often the quietest ones, the people who chose service over glory and character over conquest. Margaret had embodied those teachings and passed them on to a new generation of martial artists who understood that the ultimate victory was not defeating an opponent, but becoming the kind of person who made the world a better place for everyone. Years had passed since the Harmony tournament, and Margaret's influence had spread far beyond the walls of the community center where it all began. The woman who had once been invisible as a night janitor had become a quiet force for change in the martial arts world, though she remained as humble and dedicated to her students as she had been on that first evening when she challenged Master Thompson's 6 arrogant disciples. The community center had evolved into something resembling a pilgrimage site for martial arts instructors from around the world who wanted to observe Margaret's teaching methods firsthand. They came expecting to find revolutionary techniques or secret training methods, but instead they discovered something far more profound. Margaret's approach was rooted in ancient wisdom that had been temporarily forgotten by modern martial arts culture, principles that emphasized character development over physical dominance and community building over individual achievement. One particular visitor arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November, carrying with her a story that would challenge even Margaret's deep well of patience and compassion. Dr. Jessica Martinez was a psychiatrist who specialized in treating violent offenders, and she had come to the community center with an unusual request. She was working with a group of young men who had been involved in serious crimes and were now serving their sentences in a minimum security facility that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Dr. Martinez explained that traditional therapy approaches had achieved limited success with these individuals, who had grown up in environments where violence was the primary means of resolving conflicts and establishing social hierarchy. They had learned to equate strength with the ability to intimidate others, and their self-worth was entirely dependent on maintaining reputations as people to be feared rather than respected. The psychiatrist had read about Margaret's work with former bullies and individuals who had used martial arts training as a tool for positive transformation. She wondered if it might be possible to develop a program that could help violent offenders discover alternative definitions of strength and masculinity while serving their sentences. Margaret listened carefully to Dr. Martinez's proposal, understanding the significant challenges and potential risks involved in working with this population. These weren't simply misguided students who had been taught poor martial arts techniques by an incompetent instructor. These were individuals who had committed serious crimes and whose understanding of power and respect had been fundamentally distorted by trauma and exposure to violence. The request forced Margaret to examine her own beliefs about redemption and the transformative potential of martial arts training. Her grandmother had taught her that every person carried the capacity for both good and evil, and that proper instruction could help anyone find their better nature. But working with violent offenders would test that philosophy in ways that teaching elementary school children and assault survivors never could. After weeks of consideration and consultation with her senior students and advisors, Margaret agreed to develop a pilot program for Dr. Martinez's facility. The project would require her to adapt her teaching methods for an entirely different environment and student population, one where the normal social expectations and behavioral boundaries might not apply. The minimum security facility was located 40 miles from the community center, surrounded by chain-link fences but designed to resemble a college campus more than a traditional prison. The men housed there were serving sentences for crimes ranging from armed robbery to assault, but they had been selected for the rehabilitation program based on their demonstrated commitment to change and their lack of violent incidents during their incarceration. Margaret's first visit to the facility was both sobering and enlightening. She met with 8 men whose ages ranged from 19 to 34, each carrying stories of childhood trauma, family dysfunction, and social environments where violence had been normalized as a survival strategy. They were skeptical about martial arts training, viewing it as either irrelevant to their situation or as another form of fighting instruction that might be useful for prison conflicts. The challenge Margaret faced was fundamentally different from anything she had encountered before. These students didn't need to learn how to defend themselves physically. They needed to unlearn destructive patterns of thinking and behavior that had led them to view violence as an acceptable solution to problems. They needed to discover that true strength could come from self-control rather than the ability to hurt others. Margaret began the program with the same breathing and meditation exercises she used with all her students, but the reactions were entirely different from what she was accustomed to. Several of the men expressed open hostility toward what they perceived as weakness or mystical nonsense. Others participated reluctantly, clearly viewing the sessions as a requirement to be endured rather than an opportunity for growth. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week when one of the younger participants, a 19-year-old named Carlos who had been involved in gang violence, experienced a panic attack during a particularly intense meditation session. The breathing exercises had triggered memories of a traumatic incident from his childhood, and he began hyperventilating and showing signs of severe emotional distress. Margaret's response to Carlos's crisis became a defining moment for the entire group. Instead of treating his emotional breakdown as a disruption or weakness, she calmly guided him through techniques for managing anxiety and panic while explaining to the other participants that emotional courage was far more difficult than physical bravery. She told the group that anyone could learn to throw a punch or intimidate someone smaller than themselves, but it required real strength to face painful memories and work toward healing. The willingness to be vulnerable, to acknowledge fear and trauma was the mark of a true warrior in the most ancient and honorable sense of the term. The other participants watched in silence as Margaret helped Carlos regain his composure and encouraged him to talk about the memories that had been triggered by the breathing exercise. Her patient, non-judgmental response to his emotional crisis demonstrated a kind of strength that none of them had ever experienced from the adults in their lives. Over the following months, The dynamic of the group began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The men started arriving early for sessions and staying late to discuss the philosophical concepts that Margaret introduced alongside the physical techniques. They began to challenge each other's automatic responses to conflict and to experiment with alternative approaches to situations that would previously have resulted in violence. Carlos became one of the most dedicated participants in the program. Using the meditation techniques, Margaret taught him to manage the anxiety and anger that had previously led to destructive behavior. He discovered that he had artistic talents that had been suppressed by his involvement in gang culture, and he began creating paintings and poetry that expressed his journey toward healing. Another participant, a 30-year-old named Andre, who had been convicted of armed robbery, found that the discipline required for martial arts training helped him develop the self-control he needed to resist the impulsive decision-making that had led to his criminal behavior. He became a mentor for younger participants and eventually earned his GED while continuing with the martial arts program. The success of the pilot program attracted attention from criminal justice reformers and rehabilitation specialists who were searching for innovative approaches to reducing recidivism rates. Margaret's methods were producing measurable results in terms of reduced disciplinary incidents, improved emotional regulation, and increased participation in educational and vocational programs. Dr. Martinez documented the progress of each participant through standardized psychological assessments and behavioral observations. The data showed significant improvements in impulse control, empathy development, and conflict resolution skills among program participants compared to control groups receiving traditional rehabilitation services. The program's success led to expansion opportunities at other facilities, but Margaret insisted on maintaining strict limits on her involvement to ensure that the quality of instruction remained high. She trained a small group of carefully selected instructors in her methods, emphasizing that working with this population required not only martial arts expertise, but also deep understanding of trauma, addiction, and the social factors that contributed to criminal behavior. One of the most remarkable aspects of the program was the way it changed participants' relationships with their families and communities. Many of the men had been estranged from their children, parents, and siblings due to their criminal behavior and the pain they had caused. The emotional growth fostered by Margaret's teaching helped them develop the courage and skills needed to repair damaged relationships. Carlos reconnected with his younger sister, who had refused to speak to him for 3 years after his arrest. Through letters and supervised visits, he was able to acknowledge the harm his actions had caused and demonstrate genuine change in his attitudes and behavior. His sister eventually agreed to regular contact and became one of his strongest supporters during his rehabilitation. Andre established a relationship with his 8-year-old son, who had been raised by his grandmother after Andre's incarceration. The emotional intelligence and communication skills he developed through the martial arts program enabled him to become a positive influence in his child's life, despite the limitations imposed by his confinement. The ripple effects of the program extended beyond individual participants to influence the culture of the entire facility. Other inmates began requesting access to similar programming, and staff members noted improvements in the overall atmosphere and reduced tensions between different groups within the population. Margaret's work with violent offenders also influenced her teaching at the community center, giving her deeper insights into the roots of aggression and the psychological mechanisms that drove people toward harmful behavior. She incorporated these insights into her work with troubled youth and adults who struggled with anger management, creating more effective interventions for preventing violence before it occurred. The success of the rehabilitation program brought Margaret recognition from criminal justice organizations and invitations to speak at conferences on prison reform and violence prevention. However, she remained focused on the direct teaching work that had always been her primary calling. understanding that lasting change happened through personal relationships rather than policy initiatives. As Margaret approached her 50th birthday, she reflected on the unexpected directions her life had taken since that evening when she first challenged Master Townsend's students. The quiet janitor who had once been invisible to the martial arts community had become a respected teacher whose influence extended into areas she never could have imagined. Her story had inspired countless individuals to reconsider their assumptions about strength, courage, and the potential for human transformation. Students, colleagues, and visitors to the community center often asked her about the secret to her success, expecting to hear about special techniques or revolutionary teaching methods. Margaret's answer was always the same: there were no secrets, only the timeless principles that her grandmother had taught her, and that had been passed down through generations of martial artists who understood that the ultimate purpose of training was not to create better fighters, but to create better human beings. The true measure of her success was not in the recognition she had received or the program she had developed, but in the changed lives of people like Emma, who had grown from a bullied child into a confident young woman dedicated to helping others. It was in the transformation of Carlos from a violent gang member into an artist and mentor. It was in the hundreds of students who had discovered that their perceived weaknesses could become sources of strength when approached with the right understanding and support. Margaret's legacy lived on in every person who learned to see martial arts as a tool for healing rather than harming, in every instructor who chose encouragement over intimidation, and in every individual who discovered that true victory came not from defeating others, but from helping them reach their full potential. The simple woman who had once been mocked and dismissed had proven that the most profound changes often came from the most unexpected sources, and that the courage to stand up for what was right could transform not only individual lives, but entire communities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.